There is a mysterious disappearance that has remained unsolved for nearly a century in the winter of 1930 by Lake Anjikuni, Nunavut, Canada. A hunter lifted the flap of a familiar tent and found the hearth still glowing, the stew still simmering, the needle still stuck in the seam, yet the tent's owners were gone. A few steps away, a stone grave had been pried open. On the northern horizon, people claimed to see an uncanny blue light. From that moment, the legend of an Inuit village that vanished was born, swelling from a few dozen people to the chilling figure everyone repeats, 2000. This is not merely a story about a winter night. It is a mirror reflecting how we make meaning out of emptiness, journalism and memory, UFOs and omens, seasonal migration and human error. If this was only a hurried camp relocation who opened the grave, and if another hand was involved, why are the records silent? In this piece, you will be led from the lake's edge into the depths, sketching Anjikuni's deep freeze geography, portraying the Inuit community before the event, reconstructing the night of the locked door, tracing the ink of the initial investigation, unpacking the proliferating variants, weighing down-to-earth hypotheses alongside the allure of UFOs, then returning with a razor of skepticism and a sociological lens. When we finish, we may still not have caught a culprit, but we will understand why that half-driven needle has haunted nearly a century, and perhaps why at times not knowing is a virtue. If you're ready, fasten your coat and follow the wind. We begin where the story starts, the frozen night at Anjikuni. Northern nights have no edge. Snow and darkness twine like two layers of an ancient beast's hide, and the wind stitches invisible seams across the frozen lake. At the place people call Lake Anjikuni in the remote Kivalliq region of Nunavut, Canada, there is a story that has passed through nearly a century, yet still sends a shiver through collective memory, an Inuit village that suddenly vanished. The tale is often told in a campfire whisper. A lost hunter stops at a familiar settlement and finds the hearth still glowing, the stew still quivering, a needle still stuck in a half-sewn coat, and not a single soul around. Some say perhaps 20 people slipped away in silence. Others swear the number must have reached into the thousands, 2,000 even more, as if an unseen hand had lifted an entire community off the ice. And then, as the narrative embroideries tighten, stranger details join in the sled dogs lying curled and dead in the snow. A grave dug open its stones set neatly to either side, a blue light somewhere along the horizon. True or not, the storyteller knows how to rub a pinch of cold salt into the listener's curiosity. In a newspaper piece from that time, they wrote that the hunter, whose name would later surface in many retellings, ran through the night to telegraph the authorities. From official reports, however, a contrary line emerges. There was no large village there and no patrol record of a comparable catastrophe. Two information streams, like contrary winds scuffing the ice, grind against each other and leave a long hairline crack that has lasted 95 winters. This piece chooses to walk the space between those cracks. I will follow faint traces from early 20th century reportage to skeptical monographs from the trapper's account to UFO-loving paperbacks and even indigenous lore to reconstruct not a single answer, but a map of possibilities. In a land where the aurora spills down ribbons of ungraspable color, what matters may not be a final verdict, but understanding how a story could travel from a lakeside cluster of skin tents to millions of pages and screens while still carrying its first breath of cold. That night, as the tellers have. It was so frigid, the sound of footsteps went numb. From the taiga's edge, wind threaded the tent poles, lifted the hides, and then fell still, an utter stillness, as if even sound had been locked in ice. Had someone arrived a heartbeat too late, they would have found a whole settlement paused midline, a ladle left askew, flame taking a first bite of dry wood, the needle standing upright like a boundary stake. Even if that image is a tapestry woven from collective memory, it is strong enough to draw us closer, as though we might peer beneath the ice to find the last trace of a warmth just gone out. I will not pronounce judgment. First, I want to place you where the story begins at the rimless ice, a sparse clutch of tents swallowed by white, and a question opening like a mouth. From here, we'll descend into the underlayer, beginning with the geography of Lake Anjikuni, a harshness that has shaped Inuit survival itself. Only by understanding how thick and cold that base sheet runs can we hear the first delicate crack in the tale of disappearance. To understand why a story can freeze so solidly in memory, we have to lay a hand on the geography that birthed it. Anjikuni isn't a convenient dot on any tourist map. It's a string of deep, cold waters drawn across Kivalik, like a blue tendon stitching lakes and river bends together, hiding among ice-scoured rock and sparse taiga. In the months when days are thin and nights are thick, the water turns to a misted pane of glass. Beneath it, whitefish and lake trout glide in silence. Above it, the wind, an invisible thing that weighs like lead, pushes human sounds back to the margins. From the air, this land looks like a sculpture in ice, thousands of storm handprints pressed into the earth, carving deep grooves, hemming in the dark smudges of dwarf forest. Winter brings temperatures that a tempered imagination strains to grasp. A cheek laid bare to the air burns and breath shatters into glass. Yet in this environment that seems to refuse life, Inuit have moved through generations, inscribing stable roots across seasons. When the ice sets, they read its hairline cracks as if reading a book. When the ice breaks, they follow the water shadow, the caribou shift camp as one turns a page. In Anjikuni, distance isn't measured in kilometers, but in effort. A mile on ice with a headwind is longer than a mile on grass. A snow-stepped river can become a canyon. One change in wind can force a whole community's plan to turn. In that world, a compass helps, but isn't enough. People read the season by the sheen of the aurora. Read the weather by the creak of ice twisting. Read the path by caribou prints peeking under a dust of new snow. Paper maps are the indulgence of warm rooms. The true map is kept in memory and skill, a collective store passed by story song and tiny signs on bark. Anjikuni is also the art of empty space. What Southerners call remoteness is here the most basic habitat. The big gaps between human settlements keep nature from being exhausted. That sparseness lets a few families balance delicately between eating and saving, taking game and letting herds recover. But the emptiness tests you too. A storm, a thin fish season, a caribou migration off course, and the balance lurches. In a single shift of season, a cluster of tents can vanish like a held breath, leaving snapped stakes, stiffened rawhide cords, brittle fish bones and footprints drifted over in the night. It's no accident that vanishings prefer places like this. Deep cold thins all traces one gust erases. Hard ice makes any search demand time, and people two things the land doesn't gift. The sky, the circumpolar sky, so wide it makes your thoughts small, is ready to project what you think you see, unnameable gleams, edge of vision movements, easily confused with mirage born of frost and fatigue. Light, here in winter, is a different substance. It knifes in from low angles, sharpening everything, serrating the horizon. Night isn't pitch black, but dusted with silver, where the aurora drops its curtain, shivering thread-like green, then shifting to violet, to blue. Those ribbons often read as omens by travelers, not from superstition, but because under this planetarium of a sky, one can't help reading. Signals are part of the stagecraft. Nor is nature the only actor. Anjikuni's geography is a thin tendon of trade in snow-seasoned sleds and feet. In open water, little boats hugging current. Food caches sit in natural ice larders marked by stone signs only insiders parse. Leaving word if you must go far happens at waypoints strangers won't notice. In such a system, no people doesn't necessarily mean missing. It can be the exhale in a community's breath, a shift to another lake in the chain, waiting for next season. In that same system, an outsider out of rhythm may look at a temporary absence and name it with words that are too big. Another quiet reality language, Anjikuni, even without tracing its proto-phonetics, whispers like an old word. Names here carry riverfish rock ice. They mark relation, not possession. Inuit often name where they live with dynamic descriptions, the place where water shallows under a south wind, the place where ice cracks in early spring, the place where caribou turn when the 10th moon rises. So the village in later retellings may not match a city imagination's village, more likely a mobile seasonal camp opening and closing like a palm. Zoom out. Anjikuni sits on an ancient water vein tied to great northern rivers. Fur traders once passed small silhouettes, tugging heavy toboggans, swapping beads and metal for pelts, news and stories. Those stories, after hundreds of kilometers of ice and forest, end up like the land itself, expanding and shrinking with seasons vivid or faint, depending on the teller. A rumor, a report, a telegram all must cross storms and stopovers to reach an ear. By arrival, they carry smoke, scent, seal fat, the scuffs of wind, and sometimes frost stuck to fact. Perhaps that's why when whoever one evening stood on the lakeshore and gazed at an old camp, now empty, everything around them amplified the feeling, the ice like a stage, the sky like a backdrop, the wind like a string section holding a single low note. In such an architecture of sensation, a village not there becomes an event, a drama at its knot, an invitation for imagination to write the rest. I stress this not to deny or affirm any detail, but to say geography with Anjikuni's depth of cold width of emptiness and stubbornness isn't just setting, it's co-author. It inscribes a hard-to-read mark on everything. A fine crack on ice might be a path or just a scratch from wind. A glow at the horizon might be aurora or tired eyes drawing on the night. In this blur zone, legend has conditions to breed. And from there, once the scene comes close enough, another detail lifts. The people who pitched these tents, lit these fires, stirred this stew, tied these dogs, pushed this needle. Who were they? How did they live? How did they see this land? If geography is the co-author, Inuit are the first storytellers. We will go to them to learn how to hear ice breathe, how to read wind, and how absence can sometimes be a different form of presence. before in one particular winter everything fell suddenly silent. Before the name Anjikuni became a latch on a mystery, it was simply a resting breath in the migration calendar of several Inuit families. They set up skin tents on slightly raised ground along the lake, out of the wind's direct path with dwarf willows and dwarf birches at their backs, and a sheet of frozen water like a giant pane of glass before them. There, elders told stories so children could learn the seasonal routes. Men patched sled lines and honed bone knife edges. Women stitched fur garments, rendered seal fat, and hung thin strips of meat to dry. Nothing mysterious there, if by mysterious we mean something never lived through. What existed instead was the precision of small habits honed over millennia, how to build a fire so its smoke wouldn't signal to the wind how to set a fish trap without cracking the ice, where to lay a wooden spoon so the hand can reach it easily at dawn. I imagine, and surviving fragments suggest as much, that mornings at Anjikuni often began with the muffled barking of sled dogs and the ice stretching itself like an old wooden bed. The adults stepped to the lake's edge and read the surface to guess the day. Some mornings the ice sang high and thin like a string. Other mornings it kept still. Breakfast was something warm and fatty enough to stand up to wind. Children practiced sliding, practice casting the spear. They could read the tracks of snow buntings better than letters on a page. In the largest tent park, communal kitchen park council space hung objects like amulets, carved bone pieces, animal teeth, dried sinew strips, keepsakes, and also a way of recording events. Eafuk life in the North was kept in small objects like these, not ledgers. This rhythm did not cut them off from the outside world. Between seasons, trappers or fur traders stopped by to swap knives, bullets, needles pots for fox and marten pelts, and to trade news of where the caribou herds were drifting. Such meetings were both wary and cordial. Strangers needed fire and shelter. Residents needed information. Their road stories, full of wind stopovers and lake names hard to pronounce, updated the community's living map. A man might not know the name of a town hundreds of miles away, but he knew exactly where the water would draw down during the next lunar week. The population at Anjikuni was likely not large. A core cluster of tents, a few auxiliary shelters, small caches buried under snow. For Inuit, a village is a waypoint in a migration ledger. When ice is good, they fish for whitefish. When the herds shift, they follow caribou. When open water returns, they tuck into wind-sheltered coves to dry gear and reinforce boat frames. Sustainability lies in mobility, not stone walls. Thus, an empty camp one day isn't a full stop, but a comma. People here move with the food, the warmth with rules as old and precise as the stars. When wind turns, they shift the tents. When fish thin, they pull stakes, lash bundles to the smallest load, call the dogs, and go. Yet within that motion, some things are constant. Chief among them is how they tell the world. At Anjikuni, children grew up with stories of the spirits of ice and wind, of guardian beings above, of places one should not behave carelessly. Stone piles of certain shapes, rules about respecting the prey and returning bones to the sea. These are not mere beliefs. They are survival codes wrapped in images to be more memorable than dry clauses. Don't speak of big fish on thin ice. It sounds like superstition, but is a reminder to lower noise so the ice doesn't crack. Relations with outsiders walk a line between need and guard. They needed rifles, steel needles pots. They needed to sell pelts at posts dozens or hundreds of miles away. They needed to know where to wait out a storm if a sudden move was required. But they also understood that incoming information could loosen old seams. An overeager stranger might, without meaning to upset the delicate balance of hunting, and storing. A salty rumor could pull a younger generation beyond safe distances. Thus, hospitality and reserved friendliness and silence coexist like two faces of a tent flap. Some details get lost when the story veers toward the sensational, like the value of sled dogs. Here, dogs aren't pets or ornaments, they are stored energy transport companions. Inuit know each one, its strength, its temperament, when winds rise. They rarely abandon dogs unless faced with ruthless choices. So when later accounts claim a team lay dead, those who have lived in north winds understand at once the scale of tragedy if true, and if not, they see why the detail so efficiently tightens the throat of warm climate readers. There are also concepts that don't translate neatly. Grave to a tempered imagination implies soft earth shovels headstones. Where ice and rock rule a resting place is often a cairn stones carefully piled compressing memory and a promise to remember. Disturbing it is taboo not only for the dead, but for community order. Thus, when the Anjikuni story carries the detail of a grave opened, it pierces a deep, unwritten law. That detail both amplifies the eerie tone and unsettles those who know ice law. Is it real or a flourish added by a later hand? Within this delicate structure, knowledge is shared wealth. Ice paths aren't drawn in ink, yet elders can point out wind with eyes closed for tomorrow. They know which kinds of cracks sing danger and which are just the ice flexing under night frost. They know where to place caches so scavengers won't scent them, and which caches are last resort after all others fail. These intangible assets have carried small communities through many seasons. Seen from outside, they can be misread as mystery. I think of that last afternoon before the so-called event, if we may call it that. Perhaps it was ordinary, someone finishing a sleeve seam, someone thickening stew, someone tightening the lead dog's line. A decision may have been made, go or wait. In this land, decisions aren't rare. Error margins are. They've done this for generations, weighing wind food strength and time. Only this time on the far side of the story, an out-of-rhythm traveler arrived, and the just created emptiness was instantly labeled with very large letters. Now that the human backdrop has come into focus, the seasonal rhythms and the ice's silent laws taking their place in our imagination, it is time to return to the moment often treated as the flashpoint of myth and night, said to be in November, when a trapper knocked on a tent flap, and no one answered, when fires still glowed and a pot still simmered, when the silence suddenly thickened like multi-year ice. From here, the tale moves into its coldest light, the course of a disappearance or a temporary absence misread, depending on what we choose to call it. The man who came out of the snow said the wind that day sliced his face like a thin razor blade. He had traveled for hours, planning to stop at a familiar cluster of tents on the south shore of Lake Anjikuni to ask for fire and a corner to sleep. From afar, the tent poles showed through drifting ice dust like sewing needles stuck halfway into the white cloth of the lake. No dogs, no voices answering. Only the distant hoarse breath of ice cracking somewhere. He knocked on the first tent flap. The dry hide rustled. Silence. He pushed the flap aside. The coals still glowed at the edges. The smell of unspent seal fat hung faint in the air. On the stone hearth, a pot of stew quivered its oil, forming little veins like frost patterns. On the hide, laid out beside it, a heavy coat lay half-finished, The needle stuck at an angle, the thread stiff where it had just slipped through the last eyelet. He called the owner's name in that clipped northern tongue. No answer. He touched a wooden bowl, a spoon still warm. An unnamed sensation slid up his nape as if someone stood behind him waiting for one more step so they could swing the door shut. In the second tent, the third, the fourth, the scene repeated like mirrors facing each other. Fire still alive, food, half-prepared tools, mid-use. In one corner, a bundle of fish weirs, coils of rope neatly wound. In another, a few cartridges and a bone knife polished smooth. These are the things people here would take first if they had to go far. Yet they lay here like sentences cut off mid-page. Outside the tent, no fresh sled tracks, no toboggan grooves carved into ice. On the thin, clean snow, wind had passed and ironed it flat as blank paper. The man said he went to the edge, where teams were usually tethered windbreak side. He found bodies curled under a skim of snow. 7 dogs and all eyes shut as if asleep, frost clotted on the ruff of their ears. The lines were still there, tied fast. No human prints around them but his own. Sled dogs in this land are extensions of human legs. You don't leave them unless something sudden forces a brutal choice. The picture now had a torn seam, the calm of empty tents, and the mute tragedy of 7 curled bodies, 2 lines from different songs laid one atop the other with no bridge. Near the small grave place, if we may use the word for those low cairns of stone, he stopped. There, among the low stacks, marking where the gone have chosen to stay, one place had been altered. Heavy stones had been lifted aside and set in 2 neat rows, and the hollow within, where there should have been bone and cloth, was empty, like a snow pocket freshly scooped by a human hand. In ground, locked by ice and rock, winter drifts hard as porcelain. An animal couldn't pry these stones like a lid. Hands had worked here, hands that knew leverage and the law. But for what? What could make Northerners touch the most taboo thing? He stood a long time until wind, hissing through the stone gaps, sounded like a whisper. In later tellings, that's when a pellet of cold lodged in the narrator's throat. He understood. He stood at the rim of something beyond a traveler's capacity to resolve. Hunger had made his hands shake. Cold had blinded him. Storms had driven him to his knees. But what faced him then did not belong to that familiar trio. It was a composite, a rushed calculation somewhere to leave tents with embers glowing, a leaving behind of essential gear, a team of dogs tied to fate, a grave yawning open in the wind. He turned, pulled his coat tight, and went. The year's reports say he traveled through the night to the nearest telegraph. His stride may have switched from a hunter's rhythm to the cadence of a man pursued by an idea. Along the way the ice cracked in long tones. Perhaps he saw something at the horizon, a flick of blue. In the polar context, such light might be aurora bleeding like watercolor. In the printed retellings to come, it becomes a marker. Something flew past, flashed, and drifted it toward Anji Kuni. Collective memory often needs a distant lamp to pull events into alignment. Once the signal left the operator's hand, the story stepped out of the realm of objects and warmth into the circulation system of news. Someone at the other end received it. Someone put it into the clipped rhythm of copy. Someone wondered whether a man out of step had misread a temporary emptiness. In the days that followed, men with badges went to the lakeshore. They followed vague coordinates, crossed dwarf, scrub-crested ice ridges to find a cluster of tents without people. What they saw in turn would be brushed smooth by wind on the way back. Some oral reports say they confirm the familiar details, Hearthpot Gear Dog's grave. Others, dry and skeptical, crossed each out. No large village, no mass disappearance, no paperwork worth filing. Here the story split like spring ice. One branch, rich with image and human breath, kept speaking in the hush of snow. A man arrives, finds life interrupted, mid-gesture, finds a mute team of dogs, finds a grave opened, sees the sky make a sign, runs to report, and finds no one to touch the answer. The other branch, written in forms and stamps, says its inflated population charts don't show a village big enough to call a village. The night was only a seasonal camp. Ghastly details were perhaps sharpened by a clever pen. The branches don't shout at each other. They run parallel, each with its own readers. I think again of the half-finished sleeve, the needle pinned in fabric, as if the sewer had stepped away to fetch more thread. That's an image no administrative report can reproduce. It's the thing that stops readers' eyes for longer than usual, as if that needle pinned them to a possibility that lives depart without warning, leaving bodies in mid-motion. For those who prefer tape measures and numbers, other details snag. If they left collectively, where's the route? If they were taken by another will, where is its trace? If nothing at all, who opened the grave, and for what? A later article retelling the old story with a tasteful chill ended with a flat line. That silence year after year kept its place on the ice. The line, oddly enough, is exact, for even as layers of new narratives would be stacked, UFOs, Wendigo conspiracies, plagues, the first core remains a monochrome still red coals, simmering pot stuck, needle-tied lines, 7 dogs, open cairn, and a man traveling through night. All embroidery begins from that cloth. And from there, when the scene seems to subside, another detail emerges, the bootsteps with badges and notebooks' eyes that crossed that whole belt of ice and did not see what the storyteller wanted them to. What did they write? What did they omit? What tone did they bring back, snow or ink? And why did a newsroom so far south become the first window through which the world peered at Anjikuni? That is what we must follow next, the initial investigation and reaction where truth may have been held under ice or reshaped by words. When the story left the firelight of the tents and stepped into the jaundiced glow of a telegraph room, it changed shape, changed tempo too. The signaler community has vanished, crossed hundreds of miles of ice and forest, and fell into the ears of men with badges and notebooks. From here on, authoritative footsteps began to press on to the fine snow of oral lore. No one now keeps an intact itinerary of that patrol. The surviving paperwork is like puzzle pieces fallen from a box that's lost its lid. But we can imagine their route from the smallest outpost with a telegraph, a handful of men, 2 or 3 teams' gear stripped to essentials, hard rations and rounds, straight toward the coordinates described by the informant. Everything on the way resisted haste, slant winds, green-blue rock spines jutting from ice patches of young ice in a sea of old, and especially the fuzziness of information. A camp on the south shore where there are more dwarf willows, that is the best kind of direction the North can give. And when they arrived, they stood before the same still life the trapper had described, tense, unfinished traces of life and a thick emptiness. It's said the first spoken reports were fairly neutral camp empty gear, left signs of a hurried departure no people found. But by the time those words passed through the sieve of clerks, the tone shifted. No evidence of a large village, no signs of violence. Cannot confirm allegations. of a mass disappearance. Here the line between camp and village, a mere linguistic wobble in a nomadic context, suddenly carried legal weight. Misname it, and the story levels up a seasonal cluster, becomes a fixed settlement big enough for Southerners to picture streets and houses. The report writers seemed intent on the correct term camp. The storyteller, and later the headline writer, preferred village, heavier, more dramatic. During those short days, another wire was tightening a newsroom far from the north. There, a reporter scented the bigger-than-life angle, something that could vault past a local column. He ran contacts, reread telegrams, asked old hands of the north. Details were arranged by allure, the hearth, the pot, the needle, the dead dogs, the opened grave. And so, one late-month morning, the story appeared in bold: "An Eskimo tribe vanishes." A mystery beyond fiction. From that moment, language took over the wind's old job. It puffed the edges, flattened ambiguities, erased small scratches, while cutting a longer, deeper crack. Back at the outpost, the fur-hatted patrolmen returned with cold hands and colder assessments. Their questions had to fit the discipline of procedure. If this is a disappearance, on what basis do we open a case without signs of violence, without a complaint, without next of kin pounding the door? What do we call it? In that dry framework, a seasonal camp found empty is routine in the North, not a crime scene. Thus, an internal memo was born with the ledger's tone: "No evidence of an unusual event." Cannot confirm the identity of the self-styled veteran trapper whose license suggests otherwise. A stock photograph reused carelessly in the press. Translation: to them, this did not meet the threshold to be archived as a calamity. Here the two rhythms, journalism's and the ledger's, collided. Journalism, to make readers bend over a page, needs a quicker pulse, a thicker stroke, a sentence that still smokes. Ledgers, to stand up to time's audit, need fewer heartbeats, dry ink lines that can be produced on demand. Both are right in their own way. Between the two rights, the story slid like a toboggan slipping its puller's hand. What's striking is the quiet that followed. No sweeping search, no column serialized week after week. The North then, and perhaps the South, deep in its own Depression-era crises, couldn't spare front-page space for long. News sank as news does when the next storm rolled in. Badged men kept their patrol routes. Snowwalkers kept shifting camps. On paper, Anjikuni looked no different than the day before. The hollow returned to being a hollow. And yet a single bold headline had already planted a seed. In towns that had never seen permafrost, people began to retell a village that vanished. In fur trader taverns, Northerners embellished a detail or two to keep the tale warm, a blue light someone might have seen or only heard about. An ice groan that ran longer than usual that night. The needle stuck mid-stitch, repeated as if that needle were the pin fastening the story to the wall. Official lines shrank, oral lines swelled. Some say had this been treated as an incident, patrols would have fanned out along the waterways. Notices sent to farther posts, photographs taken, the following season measurements, made a migration record compiled. Why not? The answer is regrettably banal: lean resources, other priorities, and an initial judgment that this wasn't a case. A small force spread over an enormous space must keep a harsh priority map. Anjikuni, to their eyes, then lacked the heat to displace other tasks. Bootleg suppression, intergroup disputes, mail routes, and 1,000 unromantic necessities. But legends don't depend on rigorous investigations. They depend on patience. The Anjikuni story went quiet in official channels, but it didn't die. It lodged like a fishbone in the throat of memory, so that later, when a writer fond of the uncanny rifled through a notebook of ideas, it jumped like a fish hitting warm current. At that point, the cold ink of internal memos would be read through a different lens, distrust of authority, the habit of where there is silence, there is concealment. One bestseller in Chapter 1, Voice Loyal to the Strange, was enough to give the story a second life. Before stepping into that second life mass media paperbacks, UFOs Conspiracies pause at this turn. The initial investigation proved nothing, but it performed one act. It pushed the tale into a binary. From now on, mention Anji Cooney and two camps form those who recount the red coals and the open cairn, and those who point to the file and shake their heads. They will not persuade each other. They will enrich each other's vocabularies. Instead, this side borrows that side's terms to rebut. That side borrows this side's to mock. In that tug, Anji Cooney fills with enough air to float across decades. And like all long-lived tales, when one side tires, the other takes a turn. When the ink of ledgers cools, the ink of mystery anthologies warms. When the patrolman files his notebook, the author opens a manuscript. There, the village or camp steps into a more colorful light, reading lamps, bookstore fluorescents, living room TVs, where people tell each other believe it or don't. From there, other threads will be spun, glinting saucers, shadow creatures from legend, invisible hands of the state. We will follow those threads next to see how a modern legend grows fat on paper and screen. Some stories live like seeds in winter, buried under ice, lying dormant through a long season waiting for a thaw that doesn't belong to weather. For Anji Cooney, that thaw came from the printed page. Nearly 30 years after the night of glowing hearths and an open cairn, a writer enamored of oddities pried open the North's old box, reached into the dark, and pulled out a glittering shard. A vanished village, a lone messenger, a botched inquiry. He set the shard on his desk, blew off the dust, rewrote it with a quicker pulse, and the tale left the patrol post for the bookstore. By the 1950s, as northern cities swayed to broken phrase jazz, and the first televisions blinked on in living rooms, anthologies of the stranger-than-science became evening fare. Their readers found ghost ships, radio signals from nowhere, unnamed flying objects, and like an ice cube dropped in a glass, the Inuit village by Lake Anji Cooney that disappeared. Prose now cinematized the scene, the hearth breathing, the pot sighing, the needle staring, the sled dogs curled into question marks, the open grave, a black mouth. The number 25 floated up, then receded, replaced by the whole village, a word heavy enough for Southerners to picture streets, and a bell, things alien to cairns and skin tints. That blur only made the story flow faster through the capillaries of popular imagination. Bestsellers are a south wind. They fill sails even on boats not meant to go far. One chapter on Anji Cooney, tucked among the century's great mysteries, handed the tale a new passport from a local clipping to an urban legend in formation. Each retelling dressed it for a different promenade, sometimes in detective gray creased hat, sharp pleats, sometimes in occult velvet long hem, heavy shadow. No one kept a wardrobe ledger. That task passed to other hands, publishers, editors, weekend feature writers. All loved the shiver the Old North could deliver without any fieldwork. Then the 1960s and 70s rolled in with a new curiosity, the sky. People searched meaning in strange lights. A generation named what had yet to be named, hearing of silver saucers and horizon-bending streaks. In that banquet of imagination, Anjikuni entered as a perfect guest, gone without a trace of blue light to the north, a grave disturbed and no bones. The questions locked into a campfire-ready arc, open with dread build, with a sign from the heavens, close with a door left ajar for the cosmic. Those era-defining anthologies filed Anjikuni next to the Bermuda Triangle Phantom Ship's Forest Vanishings. The table setting created an illusion of authority. Sit beside famous legends, and you inherit their aura. From print, Anjikuni slid to late-night radio, where a warm baritone poured details drop by drop, a trapper, a hearth, 7 dogs, a flicker on the horizon. From radio to TV, mystery shows dropped it in as a chill vignette under the segment Places that emptied overnight. Fiction didn't miss the cue. In the 1980s, expedition horror novelists reached for the motif of a community hollowed out in a night like a fresh knife in the drawer. One author wrote of a mountain town waking to find silence that wasn't just silence. Another set it in the desert and played with sky glow. Few named Anjikuni outright fiction needs freedom, but the lake's shadow stood behind them like a figure over the shoulder. Popular culture in this way repaid an old debt, our fear of losing the familiar place. Alongside this came a noisier wave explorer of the uncanny journalism doing what mainstream newsrooms avoided embellish. They interviewed witnesses without cross-checking records. They filled gaps with details. Scripts demand a hunting family who saw a cylindrical object breathing blue light. A search party who watched it pulse on the horizon before moving toward the lake, not just one disturbed cairn, but the entire graveyard. Not dozens missing, but hundreds, thousands, since a big village must have a big population. These ellipses twinkled across pages, persuading readers they were touching a serious mystery. And repeated enough a detail begins to look like fact. That is the old mechanism of urban legend. Repeat at high heat until the metal of imagination pours into a mold. In the early 21st century, the internet worked even harder. It dismantled gatekeeping and let stories self-copy, branch mutate. Every new post was a fresh ice fissure. Some preferred the epic, inflating the number to 2,000 to feed the appetite for awe. Others leaned into sci-fi, wiring Anjikuni into a schematic of extraterrestrial abductions. Video channels rendered smoky tints and a shaft of blue in 3D. Podcasts whispered the tale, half believing, half doubting. With each version, evidence thinned as allure thickened. Algorithms favor what's watched, and the richer meaning less verified cuts rose. Dry, patient pieces that cooled the numbers back to a few dozen, reduced graveyard to one cairn, translated odd blue light to aurora. Those sank like stones, cold at the lake bed. Of course, in the same space, a counter-melody persisted skeptics, the scene cleaners of supposed mysteries. They turned library pages of old newspapers, dug through patrol records, asked elders in Kivalik what they recalled. They found loose knots. The original article wasn't where rumor placed it. Early numbers didn't match later ones. The key details lacked second source corroboration beyond the initial teller. And the patrol system, normally disciplined, held nothing matching a mass calamity. Written in calm voices, not hostile to wonder, not contemptuous of believers, these findings were a different kind of cold wind. But skepticism blows against sensational gales. It won't capsize a bright sail, only keep hulls from smashing on rocks. The irony is that this tension feeds Anjikuni. The is-isn't quarrel sustains presence. A skeptical piece airs. A rebuttal appears, twitching the headline, "Official Cover-Up." A debunking episode runs. Another video lights a blue beam onto a rocky shore. Durable legends benefit both sides. Tellers get listeners. Listeners get the thrill of transcendence. Skeptics get to rehearse verification. Audiences in between receive an entertainment spiced with ethics. Believe but not too much. Doubt but don't lose delight. Within this current, Anjikuni gathered another layer of meaning, a mirror of how we treat indigenous peoples. From the first reports, names and voices of the very people living there were absent, the tale appropriated by distant narrators who sometimes cast Inuit as exotic backdrop for a horror show, sometimes as victims of a cosmic plot. Both approaches obscured real life, a kitchen rhythm, a jacket seam, a lullaby. More recent writers tried to return the microphone, interviewing elders, learning windwords, asking about autumn bays, listening to cautionary stories of thin ice, not to banish the uncanny, but to place it where it belongs on the line between the unknown and the need to know, not over what people have long lived. Look back from telegraph office to color TV to autoplay feeds, and you see Anjikuni taught itself to live like an underground river, sometimes surfacing, sometimes sinking, sometimes breaking banks, sometimes seeping into soil. It changed roles, often victim of exaggeration, emblem of cover-up, for some textbook case of telephone, and deeper still, a lesson in how we build meaning around gaps. Perhaps that's why when ice melts, the story's water still runs. From here, further threads were woven, variants and add-ons, gleaming like night frost. Flickers of light cairns lined like ranks, numbers swelling, then slimming together, forming a tapestry where each thread is a hand's imagining. To see how that tapestry was stitched, we must lean closer, inspect each stitch knot, and patch where it was inserted and why. That is the survey ahead, an itinerary through the variants that still glisten like dew on ice, even though the sun has risen many times over Lake Anjikuni. When a story passes through many hands, it learns to shed skins without changing its bones. Anjikuni keeps the same frame of place, a gap, a first teller, but its flesh has been padded layer by layer with tiny stitches until at times it no longer recognizes itself in the mirror. The first variant springs from vocabulary camp becomes village. In the north, a camp is a rest in the score of migration, a handful of tents, a buried cache, a name that belongs to a season. Village in urban imagination means kitchens, yards, bells, a head count in the hundreds to thousands. One slipped word and the story changes size. A few dozen people swell into an entire community. 6 tents rise into a settlement. Readers like the slippage. It gives a sense of gravity, as if the ice were thick enough to hold a grand narrative. From words, variants bleed into numbers. Accounts closest in time speak of 25-30 figures fitting a seasonal cluster. Later decades puff them up over 100,000s, finally hardening at 2,000, a round number shocking, ready to stand alongside a southern town. No one explains where a community that large lived for years, where old graves lie, where broken pottery rests. The number steps out of context and becomes the protagonist. In sensational logic, numbers don't need evidence. They need a stance. Another stitch pierces the graveyard. Early variants say, one cairn opened just one already enough to make those who know ice law feel a chill. Later variants upgrade the entire graveyard, dug up, no bones left. The image of stones neatly aligned in rows, all cairns simultaneously open, likely arose in an editor's mind, craving a tidy frame, a high camera angle, marching lines of rock, and even emptiness in between a ritual. It's visually strong and TV-ready, but because it's too well composed, it drifts away from the clumsy, quiet particularity of life in north winds, where even sacrilege tends to be awkward and discreet, not theatrical. Then the sky. Is there any polar night without a little sky show? The aurora regularly shakes out ribbons, turning cosmic depth into a stage within reach. But in the hands of those who prefer a sky with intent, those ribbons become an uncanny blue light, pulsing, spearing toward a bearing. One variant calls it a cylindrical object. Another has it shifting shape, shrinking to a bullet. Adjectives chase one another across the page, giving the feeling of a storyboarded film. Truth up close is quieter and wide enough not to need staging. From the sky, a witness is invited in a name northern enough to feel local, vague enough to resist lookup. This person hunted with his son, saw an object, was questioned by patrolmen. Quotation marks come and go without a transcript, but urban legend doesn't need transcripts. It needs a voice that sounds like I saw it. Thus, the witness is a wooden peg hammered into ice just sturdy enough to mount the backdrop. The subtlest tailoring is in filling meaning. A late retelling fixes an early logic error by swapping parts. If the lake was frozen, no waves slapping a boat, so scrap the boat, replace with a skiff trapped under the ice. Yet each fix that smooths one snag forces 3 adjacent edits. Choose full moon, and you must live with the clash between bright light and no tracks. Choose blizzard, and you must explain why coals glowed without scattered ash. The slickest variants, if slick means frictionless, often dodge logic. Focusing on sensation, linger on a pot, a needle, a dog's back. Saturated feeling will carry the rest. There's a quiet trick in the telephone game Borrowed Authority. An anthology places Anjikuni beside cases with thick dossiers, and it basks in reflected prestige. A magazine cites an internal report without providing the document because it may not exist, yet the word internal softens readers' doubt. A TV program shoots exterior at some unrelated lake, cracking, ice-howling wind to imply fieldwork without doing it right. All create the illusion the tale has been through a sieve. In reality, only its allure has. Don't blame the lovers of the uncanny alone. Even some skeptics, in their zeal to strip the magic, sometimes add varnish. A new archival find about the earliest source gets told in a triumphal key, and in the rush they ascribe motives to the first storyteller, attention-seeking selling copy, without psychological evidence. The skeptical blade without humility can nick its own hand. A fair method stacks 2 lenses, the textual to see how far the words have traveled from the ice, and the contextual to remember that here a camp empty today can be camp full tomorrow. Speaking of context, another soft-spoken but widespread variant: forced relocation. It leans on a historical truth. 20th century relocations of indigenous peoples and pulls Anjikuni into the convoy as if every emptied place must share a hidden hand. This is where the ethical gray shows to believe in that hand can be justice, a bid to restore a silenced voice, yet it risks turning any event into evidence for a blanket charge. The writer's hard task is to hold 2 truths, honor historical injustice, while not conscripting a specific tale to carry the weight of an entire history without evidence. There are aestheticized fears, too. Illustrations in blue-violet palettes, posters of wind through tent poles, a blue beam spearing midnight like the hand of a cold god. They're beautiful, and therefore make viewers want the story to deserve such beauty. That desire, noble-sounding, presses truth into a mold. Truth in the North is messy, discontinuous, anonymous. It lacks score-lighting composition, If I had to choose one emblem for the whole embroidery, I'd choose a hand-woven mat laid before a tent. It began with one strand, the man traveling through night. Then others, hearthpot, needle, dogs, cairn, everyone passing, added a strand, a number, a light, an intent. Some are strong, some frayed, some wool, some cheap modern nylon. The mat thickened, warm to the touch. But if you want to know the first strand, you must unweave, and unweaving risks. Ruin pull too hard, the mat collapses. Pull too little, the first strand stays hidden. Balance has no formula. It's the honest storyteller's instinct. By now, the tale wears enough costumes. Time to measure the bones. What real-world hypotheses have been put forward to fill the gap where the uncanny swelled? Do they explain the needle, the pot, the 7 dogs, the opened cairn? Or are they just another thin blanket over the same cold shape? In the next part, we'll put the pen to ground, leave the sky to aurora, and enter the scrub of possibilities, migration, disaster, conspiracy, crime. Their winds are weaker, dry leaves speak louder, and answers, if any, will glitter less and last longer. Time to dim the sky's lights and bring the lamp closer to the ground. Any legend that hopes to live long must pass through a narrow gate called realistic possibilities. Standing at that gate, we don't wait for the roar of a craft or the bellow of a demon. We listen for dry leaves, for ice changing its shape, for the silent arithmetic of people choosing between staying and going. The first possibility sounds like a sigh, seasonal migration, the familiar contraction and expansion Inuit have long mastered. A camp may simply have pulled stakes for the oldest reasons in the Book of Icefish. Thinned, ice-cracked caribou veered, or a cache on the North Shore promised better odds. In such a mobile design, no one here doesn't equal gone for good. It's a temporary state, a step back to step forward. Signs of migration are rarely theatrical heavy items left to lighten the load. Tent frames dropped last so the return is easier. Sled lines coiled tight. Even a pot left half full, a gesture not for outsiders but for one's own future self next season. If the trapper arrived in the crease between beats just after departure before return, he would see an open scene and read it in the grammar of closed. Thus, a mystery is born. But migration, if so, snags on the dogs. No one in the North abandoned 7 living engines like they would spoons, unless the road ahead isn't for pause a stretch of open water somewhere, a river not yet sealed, a plan to move by a small boat, making traction a burden. They went by water, a voice suggests, and therefore the dogs had to stay. Even this defense hobbles in November, when water is usually hard as glass, unless there was a lee-shadowed lead, a wide enough tongue of flow to gamble on. Weighing relative impossibilities, migrants sometimes choose the risk that makes the least noise. Dogs in such a calculus become a cruel scratch on the conscience, one that may never quite heal. The second possibility is disaster, a sudden blizzard, ice failure, disease, or a run of small misfortunes that add up to a big one. In the North, weather is not background. It's a character with moods. A storm can swing unexpectedly, a wind can betray, an ice song can crescendo beyond the usual enough to force a camp to bolt from glowing fires to a tree-lined hollow or a rock alcove. If bad luck stacks, people can lose one another in the white abandoning gear, because the only thing worth carrying is a body. In that light, the simmering pot, the stuck needle, the live coals become a snapshot of an unplanned retreat. But disaster like migration asks for traces. A storm leaves a well to break, a rim, sickness. A pattern of rapid hypothermia across multiple bodies, a run for it, a scrawl of messy prints. If none of those IFs exist, if as told the snow is flat as an unwritten page, then the disaster must be so tidy as to be near supernatural. And if we've slipped that far, we're back in the warm bath of legend. The disaster door is narrow, not because it's impossible, but because it requires residue. In the North, residues are fragile. Even fragility has a threshold. The third possibility is an unseen hand-forced relocation, a quiet plan to rationalize small settlements to fit a state remapping itself. Canada's history includes dark chapters of moving Inuit to alien places, to ink presents on toll, to maps, cold decisions written on white paper and dropped onto tents, cradles, woodpiles. Place Anjakuni alongside those chapters, and the mind readily dots lines. Officials arriving on a good weather day armed with cartographer logic, leaving cold-proof items, pots, needles, frames, and taking everything else. This hypothesis gives us an ethically satisfying tale. The strong act, the weak, our move files are locked, press goes cold. Precisely because it fits so well, it needs caution. Relocations, if they happened, usually left archives, ship logs, head counts, destinations records that leak over time. And motives tend to be anchored to concrete interests, mines, military borders. Lake Anjakuni doesn't easily wear those clothes at the relevant date. Of course, not seen isn't not there, but hard cases teach a simple rule. If your roof needs propping by too many posts, either the ground is uneven or the blueprint is wrong. The fourth, least liked but necessary, is crime group conflict, a raid for supplies, bootleg spirits chaos that slipped into death or flight. Law's edges, especially when the ice thickens, host fragile truces, old grudges, borders not on paper, but etched in memory. A passing group in old debt flares, a fire erupts on a windy night. At dawn, the living haul the wounded and leave what cannot be borne. Wind may erase claw marks, but the scent of such a night, if it happened, would linger in neighboring stories. Here, local memory's quiet counters the crime thesis. People recall storm nights and overdone feasts. They are unlikely to forget a brawl big enough to empty a camp. One stubborn splinter remains the opened cairn. It is the burr that catches every rational glove. If not off-world hands, not monsters, then who lifted stones, aligned them neatly, and touched a taboo? Within realist frames, two options: insiders, for bodily reasons, transport remains, or ritual ones, appeasement, reburial, or outsiders out of morbid curiosity or obscure intent. The first touches communal ethics, rarely done, but rarely isn't never. The second requires a nighttime actor from afar, who knows cairn handling like locals, a self-contradictory silhouette. In short, the detail resists simplification. It's a small stone that fits no socket in the wall of reason. Push it, it springs back. So what remains? A gray zone where very human stories wrestle to explain theatrically perfect details, a pot mid-simmer too neatly exclamation marked to be more than second-order memory. 7 dogs, a number heavy enough to hurt, tight enough to remember. An open cairn, a surgical strike at civilized nerves. Reality seldom composes itself so well. But we know this too. Polar scenes are unkind to late arrivals. Wind is a harsh copy editor, ice a trash can for traces, light a projector that shuffles time. A visit an hour, even 10 minutes earlier or later, might have told a wholly different tale. Between these frames, one unwritten rule of inquiry applies Occam's razor. Don't multiply agents without need. In Anjikuni's case, the blade points to the most ordinary, a small camp leaving faster than usual due to a minor variable, a sudden illness in a key role, a premature ice groan, a cache miscalculation, an unfavorable hunting sign, and the final teller mixed in his own startlement, adding a detail or two that carried the tale farther. The razor, sharp as it is, still slips on the cairn. It hasn't fully handled the dogs, but it reminds us when forced to choose quickly, nature and people behave as they usually do, simply pragmatically at acceptable cost. In sum, the ground-level models give us boots. We can walk a few steps and not a paved road to finality. What we can safely hold is the frame. Anjikuni wasn't a town lifted off a map, but a missing beat from a small seasonal camp. Someone arrived at the hour when that absence spoke loudest. Paperwork aimed to shrink it, print aimed to enlarge it. Between those hands, the cartilage was soft and easily stretched. And from there, even after trying the grounded shapes, people still want to look up, not because the sky answers, but because it lets imagination rest from the cold math. Here, another hypothesis lit its green lamp and led late 20th century readers through the long night, that of a non-human hand, a logic bending all others. We'll set foot on that fragile bridge next, not to believe or to mock, but to grasp why it seduces and why, under the aurora's ribboned glow, we want to name it in an extraterrestrial tongue. If the down-to-earth hypotheses are the cold craft of a paring knife, then UFOs are a crystal dome set in the center of the room. They catch the light, refract it into glittering shards, and make passers-by stop. Stepping into the latter half of the 20th century, Anjikuni was often placed beneath that dome. The reasoning sounds just right. Only a force beyond human could lift an entire community in silence. Only something from the sky would leave no tracks in the snow. Only an alien technology could leave hearths glowing and pots simmering without a cry for help. Some versions borrow a witness's voice to anchor the tale. I saw a blue tube of light as large as a ship's hull hover for a moment and shrink to a bullet before shooting toward the lake. The sentences are broken into breaths. Adjectives spark like flint. It persuades because it knows how to breathe. This hypothesis cannily uses a built-in asset of the North, the aurora. Celestial ribbons are a backdrop no stage hand can rig. Add the slightest hint of intention, and they become a message. A late-night radio baritone will murmur that night along the horizon, many saw the blue light tremble differently, then drop the voice, perhaps not aurora. The phrase differently is the key. It opens a room where possibilities needn't prove usefulness, only allure. But UFO is more than a hypothesis. It is a grammar. This grammar accepts disparate pieces and open cairn sample collection. Dead dogs, not target subjects. No tracks, vertical extraction. Simmering pot, instantaneous abduction. Each answer is a Lego that fits a pre-drilled hole. And since it's a grammar, it spreads more readily than an argument tellers need only learn the structure. The facts are interchangeable. Anjikuni becomes a template sentence ready to be filled into countless disappearances. It teaches people how to narrate silence in the third person, the lofty voice of those who look down from above. The appeal of UFOs also rises from fatigue with explanations that might be right. Migration storm stress misreads all plausible, but they demand a tolerance modern minds often lack, living with an ending that has no drum roll. UFOs are good manners paid to imagination. They give readers a drama proportionate to their dread. If the dread is big as the sky, the answer should come from the sky that feels fair. Proponents point to a network of other incidents, strange lights, in Alaska, continental flying saucer crazes, crop circles, though fields are far from ice. They draw diagrams, place Anjikuni at a node, and shoot arrows in all directions. The denser the web, the less random it seems. But a diagram is made of choices. Inconvenient arrows. The debunking reports, local accounts that don't align, are left off the page. The most convincing structures are rarely the truest ones. Still, it would be unfair to treat UFO talk as mere patter. It expresses a zeitgeist. The 20th/21st centuries, spacefaring with blue marble photos of Earth adrift have pushed the rim of the possible outward. Modern minds are double exposed, half trained by empiricism, half nourished by technological myth. So when standing over a hole of absence in the ice, that mind flips the sky switch. Psychologically, UFOs are how we negotiate the unknown in the language of our age. Then comes the counterpoint. Not contemptuous, just the minimal gauge, no landing traces, no scorch marks, no radiation, no independent witnesses beyond names that wobble with each retelling. Unusual light, polar regions perform thousands of variations, most not objects. Trembled differently. A subjective feel in sub-zero wind with tired eyes. Open cairn, no chain of evidence, dead dogs, fits many human scenarios. The rebuttal adds, the logic only UFOs could is a shortcut turning we don't know into therefore extraterrestrial. In the north, the rung don't know is very tall. Some skeptics are more puckish. If a civilization can cross the galaxy, only to take a few dozen or 2,000, depending on the version, and then leave a scene this cinematic. Perhaps they studied stagecraft at the same school we did. The quip isn't meant to sneer, but to remind us of a plain yardstick. The more superlative the agent, the less movie-like the trace. An absence too perfectly composed is usually an editorial product human. Reason has its limits, especially when the night is long and the sky is a well-mouthed blue. I remember standing under Aurora once, the light pulled down like someone drawing a curtain. The smell of dry snow, hot dog fur, freshly rendered fish oil, everything made the senses believe the world had layers waiting to be lifted. I understand why on such a night a teller would lay a hand on a shoulder and say, "They came and they took them." Not from certainty, but because that sentence has music. So what do we do with UFOs at Anjikuni? Perhaps what we do with every good legend, put it in the right place. It doesn't answer where, how, what, trace, why then. It answers another question. Why do we need a hand above to impart meaning to gaps? The answer, if there is one, lies in how we narrate life. We still long for an omniscient narrator, a director, to arrange the set significance poured from the sky. When ground-level models leave us hollow, UFOs offer a cadence for the closing chorus. Having looked up long enough, it's time to lower our gaze into a different darkness, not above, but within the forest of spirits and taboos where indigenous languages have long named hunger, fear, and madness in shapes like wind. Those traditions, Wendigo curses guardian beings, aren't campfire toys. They're moral rule books for communities living next to survival's cliff. Placing Anjikuni in that forest, we'll hear other registers, not engine hums, but the old naming of dread. And perhaps in those elder names, there's a shorter track to the heart of the tale. At latitudes where winter nights are so long that stories must kindle their own fires, people have named fear in order to survive. Those names, though they may sound like they come from the world's edge, are in fact the rule book of a survival ethic. When we say Wendigo guardian spirits curse, we are reading the warning board staked along the ice road where danger is, where not to tread, where a person can become something else if starved too long, chilled too long, isolated too long. Place Angie Cooney inside that lexicon forest, and you'll hear the low registers the blue sky never plays. Wendigo, in northern traditions, is an endlessly hungry being. It walks the woods with the stride of a north wind sense, cooking fat from far off, and calls people by name in a way that makes them forget their own. Some tellings say the touched grow long and thin like a sapling. Others say the eyes change color each breath, frosting another layer over the soul. Strip off the horror cloak, and Wendigo reads as a communal way to speak of hunger and fear beyond the limit, when the body is wrung dry, when gut noise betrays conscience, when a human outside remains human, but the inside has become beast. Legend, in that sense, is the village latch. It uses supernatural dread to pull people back from the cliff where survival can push them. Within that frame, Angie Cooney can be explained by a folklore that knows its business. Lean season, thick storms, disorientation. At night, an old name threads the tent seams. One person says, "Don't listen," another does. Someone slips out of the line, then another decides to move to keep the village from losing its mind to hunger and fear. Wendigo called a name an old woman might have said, not to exalt demons, but to plug rationality's gap with words strong enough to keep order. If someone touched a cairn, perhaps it followed a similar wide logic, carrying the remains of the ones suspected to have lost their name, so the fear would not spread. In that reading, disturbing a grave stops being sheer desecration and becomes a ritual, awkward, clandestine, meant to restore balance. But Wendigo isn't the only name. Along lakes, where wind is the messenger, Inuit beliefs tell of spirits with two faces, protective and warning. A being keeps the sky, another patrols the ice's edge. Others inhabit fish, caribou, unmapped paths. Told at night, these stories don't just frighten. They teach a soft ethic. Ask when you take, return when you're full, behave with reverence toward what makes tomorrow possible. A camp rooted in those habits confronted with a sign, an odd crack song, a flock veering off its usual line. A shadow on the ice might read it as spirit writing. Reading signs is a communication system in a script-poor environment. It lets a community unify action fast. Leave now, wait at the tree line. Such commands often need a reason big enough to forestall arguments. Spirits, in that sense, are the speediest rhetoric. Remember, too indigenous supernatural is not the cinemas. It rarely blazes or shows off. It seeps into routine like salt in water. A mother tells a child not to whistle on thin ice, not because a ghost loves whistling, but because even small vibrations can cause cracks. A man whispers before setting bait, not from blind superstition, but to set a visible discipline upon a difficult task. When such memories are converted into sensational language, the supernatural is turned into fireworks. It loses its moral function and becomes only costume. Angie Cooney, therefore, doesn't require a demon carnival to empty out in silence. It needs only a community fluent in the language of signs. Tonight is wrong. Because the ice sings off-key, the fish moves someone dreamt the ancestors' dream of a break. You might laugh at a dream, but in the North, Dreams often carry distilled communal memory stories retold become images. Images enter sleep. Sleep speaks in a language more persuasive than bullet points. In that context, stepping out at night, leaving pot and needle, isn't the choice of the gullible, but a tactical decision by people who trust their collective signaling system. Every time we lean on an old name, however, the modern voice nearby reminds, beware the two-edged blade. Legend instructs. It can also cover nameless fears or worse mask acts we'd rather not explain. A child lost to ice can be retold as taken by the forest's shadow, so the community needn't scrutinize its watchkeeping. A rash decision can wear the cloak of omen to evade accountability. Properly humble reason doesn't come to smash legend. It asks, whom does this old name serve at what moment within which power shape? Deeper still, the supernatural is a way to handle loss. Where earth won't yield to shovels, where stone must stand in for soil, where storms clear away mementos, sorrow needs a form to grasp. A curse, an angry guardian, a shadow walking the shore. These shapes let the living pace grief they can abstain, give offering. Say we have paid a rhythm that helps the wound close. In this way, the supernatural is a communal therapy. If one day a camp is empty, the picture they were taken may console more than they were lost in storm, because it fits the event into a longer story with roles and order. Under that light, Anjikuni appears not as a demon stage, but as a difficult exercise of indigenous psychology, how to read signs on ice, how to tell the right story so the village survives a harsh season, how to turn the unexplainable of night sounds, lights the feeling of being called into useful discourse. If so, the later city-born tellers adding masks from warm rooms were inevitable. Those masks, glittering, sometimes cover the face. A small, wise community making an error in a long night, then passing out of sight inside its own mobile design. We shouldn't take sides. Stripping the supernatural entirely from Anjikuni ignores an important psychological dimension. Promoting it to lead role pushes real people off stage. The fair stance is to place the supernatural precisely where culture puts it, a lexicon for oversized experiences. A soft fence across dangerous paths. A padded wall against explosive grief. Walking this word forest calls for a headlamp, not to banish dark, but to avoid trampling the delicate tracks of those who came before. From this forest, the path runs to the hard country of stamps and files, pages of records, memos, dry adjustments, skeptics' careful edits to overheated prose. There, the supernatural sits on the scale beside coals and needles, dogs and cairns, patrol timetables and boldface headlines. And in that land, seemingly arid, we'll see why many readers, after reading line by measured line, file the Anjikuni tale under urban legend, not to sneer, but to classify. Not to close, but to open another way of reading skepticism as a virtue. That is our next stage. Skepticism used well is like a cabinet maker's scraper. It glides lightly to reveal grain shaves off lumpy varnish, preserves the wood's original pattern. Lay Anjikuni on reason's workbench, and the veins appear, which are natural grain, which are weather knots, which places a prior hand has rubbed with wax to make them shine. The first task of the blade is to take some metallic gleam off the tail, not to desecrate it, but to expose the wood. Paperwork is colder than snow. It doesn't narrate a lapping stew or a needle standing at a slant. It uses verbs with little emotion, confirm, deny, insufficient grounds not found, not consistent. In the thick stack from the early 1930s north, there's virtually no case matching a description of a village that vanished. Instead, daily patrol notes this outpost visited that dispute settled a cache of bootleg seized drifts on the mail line a man lost one night found a tree line next morning. That picture doesn't negate an empty camp. It says empty is not by itself enough to call it a mass disappearance. The razor skims next over the protagonist, the informant. The tale's backbone depends on the firmness of those shoulders. Yet small details, a first-time trapping license, a hazy declared route, a recycled stock photo in the press from a prior decade when placed beside the bold ink of headlines, make those shoulders quiver. Quiver isn't break. It reminds us that stories must balance the teller's weight. A snowy night panic memory can amplify already dramatic details. A headline-savvy pen can tip camp into village with a single word and lift that word into the title. In newsroom language, that's normal words doing what words do. In investigative language, a word can move the compass. The scraper runs over the mirror of numbers. Numbers are like hair combed right. They fluff. From the 25-30 near contemporaneous accounts through the greatest mysteries, paperbacks, hair lifts to hundreds, then the internet gels it to 2000. The escalation isn't paired with material evidence foundations, fences, ruined sherds, hearth pits, but with the need to accelerate pulses. Reason is not Lemur's enemy. It simply asks, if there were 2,000, where are their traces after one thaw? To date, nothing answers that with more than a finger pointing skyward. The blade works into the opened grave, that knob of bone under the skin of narrative. If only a single cairn was disturbed, human world hypotheses can still breathe, reinterment rare ritual, a sick outsider's prank. If the entire grave field was dismantled, skepticism demands photos, notes, names, dates, supports, legends rarely provide. Without them, en masse reads like set design, chillin' hauntin', and hard to stand up in the wind. Skepticism also rereads the blue light. Aurora isn't a single drape. It has 1,000 variations, most odd to southern eyes. Human perception in deep sub-zero is easily tricked by microshimmers. A nightwalker's memory records the emphatic whatever felt like something happened. When a voice says different, what it truly says is, I was touched. That's worth hearing, but touch to object with intent is a long jump needing a bridge. Most such bridges are built from the need to fill a gap, not lumber. A decent blade stops, as any good tool does, at the delicate nerves of culture. You can't scrape belief entirely off the tail without stripping away the meaning communities put in their signs, nor can you allow glossy mystique to lacquer everything until the wood vanishes. Between these extremes, the tool must learn to ride edges, which parts are ethical functions of belief, signaling systems, cautionary rites, and which are flourishes for taste. The best skeptical intellect is the one that knows when to stop. Another less shiny but sturdier strut of skepticism is method. It asks about pipeline, how a tip travels, lands on whose desk, which bins it's sorted into, what thresholds open a search, what criteria trigger the label incident. Mapping the ecosystem of paperwork yields a mundane reason Angie Cooney never became a case, no evident crime, no named victims, no kin knocking at the outpost door, no scene documented in the moment. In a system with few people, many tasks, and unimaginable distances, such thresholds are coarse sieves many grains fall through. Not in the files doesn't mean nothing happened, but neither does it equal there must be a cover-up. With some varnish gone, a calmer reading appears. Anji Kuni is a textbook case of how a modern legend forms. A small core, an empty camp, a solitary teller, plus a friendly environment headlines, love chills, readers enjoy shivers, plus years of reinforcement by bestsellers, and late-night shows equal sign a thick rug. This theorem lacks saucer's glamour, but it has the persuasive force of recurrence. And like any formula, it explains why beautiful details tend to win long-term. They match the public heart rate. In skepticism's lab sits an instrument called humility. It keeps the analyst from imputing dark motives to the first teller. Perhaps he didn't plan to deceive. Perhaps he truly panicked before a strange scene and reported it the way startled memory works, pairing off messy bits, retaining striking images. It keeps the investigative writer from skipping rungs in archival find about the earliest byline, doesn't auto-convert into fabrication. A blank in the files isn't automatically conspiracy. We don't know is an honorable conclusion, the foundation for any progress. The blade also returns to the language kitchen. Words like village vanished, graveyard light have been resonated through 100 mouths. They carry echoes of late-night reading and TV segments. A fair writer resizes them camp for village empty, for vanished disturbed cairn, for graveyard dug up unusual aurora, for blue beam. Downsizing doesn't impoverish the story, it lets us hear the wood. Finally, skepticism suggests we change our footing from an audience craving the twist to a reader willing to look long. Stand on the ice edge and watch cracks creep. You'll relearn a virtue our scroll age forgets waiting. Wait for another source for better proof, for hot words to cool under a lamp. Under that light, Anji Kuni doesn't need a noisy verdict. It sits like a board with beautiful grain, a lesson in how tales swell and how a razor, gently handled, can return the original luster without tearing the fibers. From this carpentry bench step into the wider showroom, how popular culture ingested the tale, turning it into material for fiction TV and tour talk. How collective memory mixed mystery with history, sometimes blurring responsibility, sometimes enriching region's sense of itself. From skepticism's workbench to culture's gallery, that is the next section, Anji Kuni's impact and legacy, where an untrue legend can still generate real tremors, questions, and stereotypes that must be called by their names. A story truly lives only when it leaves the place of its birth and wanders through cultural institutions, books, films, TV, classrooms, tour circuits, and inevitably digital platforms. Anji Kuni did this early, wearing the cold like a rare perfume. In each space, it learned a new dip of the shoulder, a different smile, a different stance, and every change left an imprint on collective memory. In popular literature, Anji Kuni became a motif, the vanished community. Writers borrowed the structure, swapping ice for sand tents, for timber houses, aurora for fog, but kept the core of walking into a place without people. It allows a story to open with shock, sustain an investigative tempo, and close on an open end so readers can shut the book still shivering. On screen, the motif is even more potent. No caption is needed to convey the dread of a still warm hearth with no owner. A camera can simply drift over a steaming pot, and the tale generates its own sound. The blue light detail, true or not, is a gift of filmmakers turning the sky into a supporting character that knows how to act. In reality, TV and unsolved mystery formats, Anji Cooney plays the tireless model. It comes with ready-made props, a starkly beautiful environment, set pieces easy to stage tense, a hearth of Cairn, and a run of questions with kick that don't require fresh evidence. Such shows sell a feeling of participation. Viewers go on location through the screen, hear witnesses, often secondhand, see maps with dotted lines. In that world, Anji Cooney becomes a catchy song with a sing-along chorus. Adventure tourism and local storytelling also help settle the legend. Even without official promotion, informal guides share Anji Cooney by the fire. In the north, where not everyone can reach the lakeshore, telling substitutes for going a form of mental travel. One night, by the tent, a traveler may not tell wind from words. He only knows that by morning the story has stayed in his coat like a faint smoke smell. The internet delivered the final leap. It turned Anji Cooney into a cultural meme in the best sense, a transmissible unit that self-copies, mutates, attracts. 3D reconstructions, late-night podcasts, sprawling forum threads, top 10 mysteries listicles with arresting images, these are the legend's foster parents. Algorithms reward strong emotion and open endings. Anji Cooney is a furnace for both. Result, the 2,000 people vanished, Cut climbs the charts. The few dozen left camp in a hurry, Cut sinks beneath a thick slab of indifference. Digital culture doesn't just mirror the tale, it performs natural selection upon it. In classrooms, Anji Cooney sometimes appears as a case study, a drill in source reading and verification. Teachers hand out two texts, a sensational article and a skeptical analysis. Students compare language, argument, structure, use of detail. The exercise works because it places learners inside the tug-of-war between I want to believe and I must verify. In media studies, Anji Cooney is a standard exhibit for amplification mechanics, the camp, village drift, and the way numbers grow over time. Socially, the legend both draws attention to Inuit and risks aestheticizing their presence. Scary stories can turn a culture into a backdrop. Indigenous people cast as keepers of secrets for outside imaginations. Post-colonial critique reminds us, don't turn another community's sorrow and fear into jewelry for our feelings. Writing about Anji Cooney with fairness means remembering that behind the legend are rhythms, livelihoods, politics, and real historical wounds. Respect doesn't kill the uncanny. It teaches us to see it through the eyes of those who have lived with it. Anji Cooney also reflects back on media makers. It is a professional reminder that every word choice has consequences. A bold headline can carry a story into public life, but it can also drag it away from its birthplace. A careful sentence may earn fewer clicks, yet it preserves the grain for later readers. In an age of speed, first filter later, Anji Cooney, like a small antique, recommends a slower virtue. Read long, write lean. Ask the right questions. Don't borrow the sky while the ground remains unwalked. At a wider scale, the legend stands beside other emblems of collective disappearance. Roanoke, the crew of the Mary Celeste jungle hamlets, surrendered to vines. Each emblem has its era's flavor. Roanoke expresses colonial anxiety. Mary Celeste, industrial sea dread. Anji Cooney, the uncertainty of the information age, where a story can be both true and not, depending on the window you look through. Grouping them risks blurring context, yet reveals a red thread humans need, named gaps, to test their storytelling tools. Finally, cultural impact resides in how Anji Cooney becomes a small ethical proving ground for tellers and audiences alike. What will you believe when artifacts are scant, but images are rich? How will you treat another community's memory when it aligns conveniently with your tale? Can you accept we don't know the least glamorous but most honest conclusion? These questions aren't just for the North. They gauge any culture's character when faced with the lure of mystery. From this gallery, we return to the lab of social science where cultural phenomena are cross-sectioned with conceptual blades, collective fear, meaning-making, transmission mechanics, discourses of power. Through a sociological lens, Anji Cooney shows less ice and less blue light, but clearer wires connecting people wires that pulled a winter clipping into a century-long legend. Seeing those wires may help us when we close the story, keep open our capacity to ask. If we treat Anji Cooney as a natural experiment, the independent variables aren't just ice and wind. They're people with collective fear, the need to fill gaps in social pipelines for information. Sociology, when it puts a stethoscope to the tail, doesn't hope to diagnose a culprit. It wants to hear the heartbeat, why a small clipping could grow so loud, why its echo lasts when evidence is thin, and what that echo says about the tellers and listeners. Fear at the collective level has the same structure as in an individual. It needs a shape. The Arctic, its outsized white spaces, forces people to sculpt their fear into portable figurines. A wendigo, a strange light, a curse, a conspiracy. Each figurine is a cognitive tactic. Instead of fearing the nameless fear, something with a name and a story. When society folds a camp found empty into its pocket, it unconsciously stitches on a charm. Name it. Naming is the first step toward control, even if it's imaginative control. By this mechanism, Anji Cooney satisfies an old appetite, turning randomness into a proposition. The need for meaning fires like a reflex. Humans cannot stand a gap between cause and effect. We want a bridge, even one braided from twigs and vines. A simmering pot connects to left in a rush connects to forced or taken connects to by someone larger. Each link increases the brain's satisfaction. We've found a path. Sociology calls this the narrativity of cognition. The brain prefers silken chains of causality to chafing bundles of data. Online narrativity earns cash. Views, shares, comments of chills. That is how meaning gets paid. Transmission is the circulatory system, mouth to page to airwave to algorithm. In each channel, a story must adapt. Oral telling needs rhythm and image. Journalism needs a headline. TV needs a frame. Social media needs a 10-second hook. Adaptation behaves like evolution. Traits that aid survival are retained. Blue light, a visual trait, stays. One disturbed cairn, a subtle shiver stays. 25 people, a modesty trait drops. 2000, a shock trait sticks. There's no individual malice here. It's environmental law. The outcome is a version optimized for attention, not for truth. Another under-remarked wire-powered discourse. When a tale touches indigenous lives, two equal and opposite risks appear, minimizing them by flattening everything into urban logic and exoticizing them by turning them into keepers of outsiders' fantasies. Both strip away the subject's voice. Sociology proposes a different stance. Stand beside, not above. Listen, don't paraphrase. Ask what helps this community before what thrills my audience. From there, Anji Cooney stops being a frozen backdrop and becomes an ethical test for the narrator. Sometimes what we call rumor is actually risk management. Small communities need fast decision tools under sparse data. Rumors that have been refined over time can encode life-saving strategies even if the stated reasons sound folkloric. When an elder says, "Don't sleep on this shore tonight," I dreamt ill that may be her way to express micrometeorology she has no words for. Seen this way, Anji Kuni isn't just a legend nursery, it's a workshop where survival rules are forged in memorable language. Breaking the workshop by ridicule or overexposure can cost a community the very tools it needs more than reputation. What about conspiracy appetite? Sociology suggests it is a dignity-preserving mechanism when faced with historical injustice. Communities that have been relocated, monitored, misrepresented tend to read every gap as a sign of a hidden hand. The reading is both vigilance and therapy. It externalizes helplessness into a curse-able agent. If outsiders bring only the razor of doubt, they may reopen scars. The better approach runs two operations in parallel, acknowledge historical wrongs, so vigilance has standing, while keeping evidentiary standards for each specific story so the present isn't ruled by old debts. There's also the attention economy. Our era pays for what keeps eyes on screens. Anji Kuni walks into that market in perfect dress, concise, chilling, open-ended. Content makers learn quickly that debunk files underperform glittering hypotheses. Platforms tuned for engagement amplify the skew. Social science doesn't condemn. It maps the mechanism so we can arm ourselves. Receivers need disciplined diets. Producers need professional ethics. Platforms need algorithmic responsibility. Without all three legs, the table wobbles and legends become fast food, tasty, undernourishing. Lastly, sociology praises the virtue of uncertainty, the ability to live with "we don't know." Many systems reward answers, not questions. Anji Kuni teaches the opposite lesson. Uncertainty isn't weakness, it's honest ground. A community that can say "not yet known" in the face of stimulating tales shows good information health. That health may let genuinely urgent stories, ongoing injustices, be heard more clearly rather than drowned by a gale of legends. In sum, through a sociological lens, Anji Kuni is more than a mystery. It's a mirror for our meaning-making machinery. It reveals what we fear the void, what we crave, meaning, what we fund emotion, and what we forget the insider's voice. Seeing this won't melt ice or stop that pot from simmering on the page, but it steadies the hand that sets the period, where to place it, and when to let an ellipsis rest. From this system's view, the story nears its closing movement. Not a slam shut, but a braid, what we know, what likely holds, what still floats. Above all, to return Anji Kuni to its proper size in our minds, not a black hole swallowing all hypotheses, but a flat mirror. Stand at the right angle, and you'll see yourself, your hopes, and your limits. The next stage, therefore, is an open conclusion scanning the panorama, marking light and shadow, leaving a few questions for readers to pocket like small winter stones. Some stories are like embers buried in ash one breath, and they glow again. Anji Kuni is one such ember. Fact, as in data, moves on running with the seasons, changing places, thinning in archives and under time's dust. Mystery, as in feeling, stays lodged in culture's chest like a quiet pulse. Why? First, because mystery is a form of emotional fairness. Grounded answers are often bland, a hurried move, a surprise storm files never opened. They're like temperature readings, necessary, but not warming to the touch. Intuitively, a story worthy of the first shiver seems to demand an answer of equal scale, a larger hand, a bigger reason, an intervention beyond our size. Here, mystery isn't ignorance, but an aesthetic structure. It keeps narrative and emotion balanced, like the two ends of a yoke. When fact is light, mystery adds weight so we don't feel shortchanged. Second mystery is a memory technology. Collective memory isn't a hard drive. It privileges the tellable. The tellable carries three things: sharp images, an easy rhythm, an open ending. Anjikuni has all three: the trembling pot, the halted needle, the curled dogs. Those are images. The walk from tent to telegraph office, that's rhythm. The gap between empty and gone, that's an open end. So even if one day a dusty file is found with the driest of clarifications, the public memory will keep the version with music. Not because we hate truth, but because our memory is built to cradle story. Mystery also stretches the mind. In a world that meters nearly everything bandwidth, heart rate, calories, the immeasurable becomes a public park for imagination. We go there to stroll, breathe, try postures that don't wear a work uniform. Anjikuni allows moderns pinched by spreadsheets and KPIs to sense a border. That border needn't be real. It only needs to reveal our tool limits. That's a modest, healthy humility. Another part of the pull is how mystery builds community. Strangers can sit side by side, share a unified shiver, argue about a light on the horizon, and leave the table feeling they were in something together. Like any long-lived legend, Anjikuni has its fans and its antis, and both require the story's existence to keep their circles talking. Online, that becomes threads inside jokes, tiny traditions, a social glue at small scale. Don't forget the pedagogical virtue of gaps. Telling a child a story without a closing bracket trains the skill of living with uncertainty, rare in an age where every question seems searchable. Framed well, Anjikuni can be a don't rush exercise, lay out the options, check. Minimal evidence, admit missing pieces, leave the narrative in thinking mode. Good education alongside answers keeps a few in-progress stories, so learners have somewhere to practice breathing. Finally, lasting allure is an ethical reminder for storytellers. No one forces us to snap-lid Anjikuni with a thundering verdict, but every retelling can choose a pitch, the low register of respect for those who live there, for their history, for their harms, or the high register of self-satisfaction for our personal appetite for chills. Choosing the pitch is choosing the kind of narrator we are. Mystery tests not only thought tools, it tests character. Across 13 cold stages, we've touched geography, people sequence inquiry, transmission variants, down-to-earth models, UFO temptation, the supernatural skepticism, and social legacy. One task remains: gather the strands, not to draft an indictment or a hymn, but to right-size the tale, a small ember, enough to warm the teller's palms, not a blaze that eats the forest. The conclusion then won't pass sentence. It will step back, like looking at a cluster of old tents at day's end, to see what remains after the wind passes. At journey's end, when all the hypotheses have been laid out like stones gathered around the lake, we recognize a simple truth we half knew from the start. Anjikuni is not an equation with a single solution. It is a flat mirror, spread over ice. Each onlooker sees a different face. Believers see a hand pouring down from the sky. Skeptics see the murmuring shadow of journalism and memory. Indigenous people see the breathing of seasons and old silent laws, and truth, if we define it as a cold chain of data, likely left the tents long ago, like those who knew how to read the wind and knew that this was not a night to stay. Return one last time to that shore in the mind's eye, and the things appear heavy as memory and light as breath coals, glowing a pot set askew, a needle paused, in a sleeve, 7 dogs curled under a thin skin of snow, the cairn stones squared into 2 neat ranks. Over almost a century, these objects have hardened into signs. They no longer belong to one particular night. They belong to our species' storytelling reflex when faced with a gap. What remains to ask, then, is not what happened, but what do we do when we don't know what happened? The answer, if there is one, lies in the path we just walked. We tried ground-level explanations, migration, weather conflict, human error. We stepped toward the sky's temptation, UFO. As the era's grammar, we listened for old names, Wendigo omens. We shaved back the varnish with skepticism, files, numbers, rhetoric. Then we stepped out to a cultural square media memory social habit. None of these layers cancels the others. They stack like ice seasons, some cracked, some clear, some opaque. At the center are small humans, the man who walked through the night, families bundling in haste, patrolmen trudging their routes, reporters hungry for words, readers hungry for feeling, and indigenous communities who deserve to be spoken of in their own voice. What gives Anjikuni its long life is not an answer, but a lesson in the virtue of uncertainty. We live in systems that reward quick answers and the sensation of having understood. Enduring tales usually require the opposite virtues, patience, humility, and a willingness to admit that not knowing is not failure, but honesty. It may sting like a north wind, but it clears the air so we can see the real cracks underfoot instead of fogging the glass with our breath-borne halos. From journalism's vantage, Anjikuni reminds us of the responsibility of a word. Between camp and village lies a continental distance, one that drags along response levels, emotional volume, and the way history remembers. From a cultural vantage, it cautions us not to garnish another people's sorrow into our amusement. Better to learn how to stand beside rather than above. From a sociological vantage, it's a neat equation, small core plus amplifying environment plus emotion-favoring algorithms equals sign legend. From a human vantage, it is a mirror in it. We meet ourselves, our dread of gaps, our hunger for meaning, our tug-of-war between belief and verification. If forced to choose a closing image, I pick the needle stuck in a sleeve hem. It is quieter than any grand pronouncement. It says that life always stops at the midpoint, and we latecomers have a choice: pull the needle and stitch on an ending we made up, or leave it standing to remind us of incompleteness, which is no less true than any answer. With Anjikuni, I leave the needle where it is. Let the story breathe under the ice like a pot still warm after the fire is gone. Not to feed rumor, but to feed the habit of looking longer, listening closer, and naming more carefully. And if you ask whether a lost file, a muffled testimony, a dust-laden photo might surface one day to quench the legend, I'll say perhaps. If that day comes, another virtue will be needed, the virtue of retreat, knowing how to close the book without clutching the mystery as personal property. Some mysteries are born to go. What should remain with us is the skill of handling gaps, not the shell of a shiver. On that shore, wind still crosses the aurora, still drops green threads on black, and somewhere another cluster of tents in another time lights a fire. New tales will spark. May we remember Unjikuni then not as a name to summon goosebumps, but as a pocket lesson. Know when to stop, when to wait, when to listen, when to respect.